Hello ma'am, this is my project presentation on the subject of understanding the self, and in this video, I will discuss about the self-concept. Let us begin with the definition of self-concept. Self-concept is a personal summary of who we believe we are. It is how we answer the question, who am I? It includes our assessment of our positive and negative qualities, our relationships to others, our beliefs and opinions, and more. Our self-concept is a personal summary of who we believe we are. We acquire a self-concept in several ways, including the following. First, we compare ourselves to others is a social comparison theory. Second, culture creates expectation about how the self should behave. It is a social identity theory. And last, we create mental structures that direct the self's attention, or it is a self-schema theory. Let's consider each of these theories in more detail. First, the social comparison theory. Social comparison theory proposes that our sense of self is influenced by different types of social comparisons, including the first is the upward comparison, second is the downward comparison. Upward comparison is comparing the self to someone who's better. Downward comparison is comparing the self to someone who's worse. Social comparison theory proposes that we use social comparisons to construct our self-concept, especially when we have no other objective standard available to us. How do you know if you are shy, competitive, rich, anxious, or anything else? These subjective ideas only become meaningful in comparison to others. For example, if you are walking alone on the beach, you may not even be thinking about your physical appearance. But when someone much more attractive walks by, the unflattering social comparison can deliver a small shock to your previously contented self-concept. At a basic level, there are two types of social comparisons we can make: the upward social comparisons and the downward social comparison. Upward social comparison is we compare ourselves to someone who is better than us. This type of comparison can be useful when we want to improve on a particular skill. An example of this is most people who like to watch cooking shows with celebrity chefs enjoy getting tips on how to make their own food taste or look better. Next, the same is true for people who get ideas about home decorating from Martha Stewart or by reading magazines with ideas. And the last is when athletes learn from coaches. However, constantly comparing ourselves to people who have excelled can lead to frustration or even depression. An example of this is, why can't my cupcakes look as good as the ones on Pinterest? So by comparing ourselves to people who have excelled, it can lead us to frustration. Next, the downward social comparisons. This occurs when we compare ourselves to someone who is worse than we are. This might not help us improve, but it sure feels better. An example of this is, my cupcakes might not win any cupcake reality show contests. Sure, but it's better than the cupcake my daughter tried to make. Next is, my tennis skills aren't on a professional level. Maybe, but I'm better than the guy in the next court who can't hit a single ball over the net. This presentation is about social comparisons, 4 factors relevant to our subjective processing of what we see around us, or the WIDE guide. The meaning of WIDE is who, interpretation, direction, and esteem. So let us begin in who. Who, we evaluate our abilities automatically by comparing ourselves to similar others. Example, tennis players who are about my ability level or a little better give me the most useful social comparison feedback. Interpretation. Interpretation is how we interpret social comparisons influences our self-concept. Moving into a group home with sick elderly neighbors could be processed in 2 different ways. First, thank goodness that I'm not that ill. Second, very soon I also could be just as needy. The third meaning of wide is the direction. The direction of our social comparison influences our self-concept. Comparing myself to better tennis players is an upward social comparison that makes me feel worse. And comparing to worse players is a downward social comparison that makes me feel better. Downward social comparisons tend to enhance our self-concept. The last one is the esteem. Esteem is protecting our self-esteem influences our self-concept. The losing tennis player may say to her opponent, "You played extremely well today," implying that her opponent had to play his or her best to beat her. This presentation is the second theory of self-concept, which is social identity theory, as described as the mixture of a personal and a social identities. Your complicated self is organized around what Taj Fell calls social identity theory, which proposes that our self-concept is composed of a personal identity and a social identity. And the self is composed of two general categories: personal characteristics. Under the personal characteristics is serious, funny, grumpy, tall, or rich. And the social role characteristics. Under the social role characteristics is son, mother, Catholic, or accountant. And I am giving you an example of personal identity and social identity. Under the personal identity is the Western culture, and in social identity is the Asian culture. So in personal identity, the Western culture is listed here is the independent self-control, the autonomy, individualism, independence, assertiveness. And under in social identity in Asian culture is the interdependent self-control, which is relatedness, collectivism, interdependence, and self-effacement. This means that the ideal self in one culture is very different from the ideal self in another culture. So I am giving you another example of how culture affects views of the self. There are two cultures here, the American culture and the Japanese culture. To guide group behavior, American culture recommends that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In Japanese culture, the nail that stands up gets pounded down. To get children to finish their food in American culture, children think of the starving children in Utopia and how lucky they are to be American. In Japanese culture, children think about the farmer who works so hard to produce the rice for you and how disappointed he or she will be if it is not eaten. Third is to improve worker productivity. In American culture, workers stand in front of a mirror and repeat, "I am beautiful." In Japanese culture, workers hold a co-worker's hand and repeat, "He or she is beautiful." So this means that this example help us understand and how cultural norms influence how we think about the self. This presentation is the last theory in self-concept. It is called self-schema theory. Self-schema theory suggests that we organize our beliefs about ourselves into mental structures and memory. So a schema, in general, is a cognitive and memory structure for organizing the world. So self-schemas transform the raw material from cultural and social comparisons into the building blocks of our self-concept. According to Hewitt and Janis in 1919, creating what Servon in 2004 calls the architecture of personality. For example, let's say that you wake up late on Wednesday morning. Is your latest because you are lazy or because you work so hard that you're exhausted? You then speed in traffic heading to your job. Is your speeding because you are a dangerous, careless driver or because you are responsibly trying to get work as quickly as possible? When you get to work, the first thing you do is get some coffee from the break room. Are you addicted and trying to procrastinate, or are you simply trying to get focused so you can be efficient? Instead of chatting with coworkers, you head straight to your desk. Are you rude or simply motivated to accomplish that day's task? So your self-concept creates a coherent self by activating particular self-schemas that help you interpret your own behavior. In this example, your efforts to get to work could lead you to think of yourself in two different ways. First, you are lazy, dangerous, addicted, and rude. Or second, you are hardworking, responsible, highly motivated, and determined to succeed. How you interpret the flow of everyday events in your life depends on which self-schemas have been activated, as the schemas create cognitive frameworks for you to interpret the events of your life. And that would be all. And thank you.